Greetings and welcome to today's 10-minute painting. We're going to begin here, as we generally do, with our large square-headed brush and some titanium white pigment. I'm going to apply it to the entirety of our sky, and then I'm going to take that same pigment and apply it to the reflection of our sky down where our water will be. We're just creating a good white base here. Then I'm going to take some primary yellow, apply that to the bottom of our horizon and to the bottom of our reflection as well. Then I'm going to go back to my palette, grab a little bit of pre-mixed orange. This is simply a mixture of a little bit of primary red and a good amount of primary yellow. I'm applying this to the top of our sky and blending it back downwards. I'm going to do this on the bottom in our reflection as well. It's worth noting that we used the white initially because we wanted to thicken our pigments a little bit and desaturate them. Innately, colors like primary yellow, primary red, primary blue are fairly transparent, and you might have to do a couple of layers with them. However, pigments like titanium white are very opaque. So by using that in your mixture, you don't have to do as much layering. It makes the paint a lot thicker and it makes creating these scenarios a lot easier. Then I'm going to take an old square-headed brush, one where the bristles kind of leaf off in varying directions, so when you make a dabbing motion with it, it renders a litany of different implications on the brush. And in this case, those implications imply clusters of leaves and foliage in the background. It's a really quick way of getting this sort of thing done. But with that being said, right now we are applying a very light green color. This is a mixture of primary yellow and a very small amount of primary blue. I'm essentially outlining all of our trees, and this is the brightest green we're going to use because the light from the background is catching all of it. It's absorbing in the tops of these leaves and there aren't any shadows being cast upon them. However, we're now going to add a bit of a darker green to the center and blend that out again in a dabbing motion. We're doing this because this portion of the tree, it's not getting as much light. It has the top portions absorbing all of the light and the light isn't getting all the way through to it. So it's just an easy way to establish depth. The light pigment, the medium toned pigment, and the darker pigment are also great for building your values and ensuring that it looks very three-dimensional. It's also worth noting that I'm only really using the darkest portions of this pigment in the foreground and I'm not in the background because the light from the background would wash them out to a good extent and it'll just again help build depth within our painting. Now I'm going to take my medium-sized square-headed brush and a bit of titanium white. Here I'm going to begin building up a reflection of our sun down here in the water. Now I haven't drawn the sun in yet, but I know where it's going to be, so I can begin working in our reflection. I'm applying this in a litany of horizontal strokes, and I'm trying to ensure that the middle portion of this reflection remains the most dense and the most white. And then as we move to the right and to the left, it dissipates and blends with our initial colors that we applied on the canvas here. This might take a couple of layers. As the water area, it might still be a little bit wet and the white might blend with the oranges and the yellow. So if you find that's the case, just let it sit for 5 or 10 minutes, then come back in and add your reflections. Here I'm creating a little bit of a glow for our sun and adding our sun in as well with my smaller round-headed brush. You generally want to use round-headed brushes to render softer aesthetics because they don't have sharp edges like the square-headed brush. With that talk of the square-headed brush, here though I am creating a dividing line between our land and our water just so we know where our trees end and where our reflections begin. There I was just using a fairly close light green. I didn't want to use a pure white for that portion of the water because I didn't want it to be too stark. I didn't want it to stand out. I wanted the real light areas in the painting to be the reflection and the sun itself. Then I'm creating some clouds in the sky with my smaller round-headed brush. Again, clouds, they're very soft and they have a very feathered edge, which is why the round-headed brush is fantastic for rendering them. It doesn't render sharp edges generally. It's also worth noting that we didn't do a conventional cloud. We did one that's kind of works in lines, which is great because then it acts as leading lines and aids our composition in the painting. It directs the viewer's eye to where we want it, which is our tree, which we've drawn in the foreground. So that's a very easy way to incorporate leading lines and directional composition work in all of your paintings. Just ensure that your clouds are pointing to the main subject. It's such an effective, easy thing you can do that you can add to almost any painting. Now from there, I'm actually going to begin working on our foreground, and I'm using a smaller square-headed brush. I know my hand's in the way and there are a couple of cuts. I did need to change my battery, but I didn't, and had a couple of technical issues. But luckily, you don't really miss anything here. I was fairly cognizant of what it was doing and I was watching, making sure. So it does cut a couple of times here, but you don't really miss anything. With that being said, here I'm using a Mars Black and I'm drawing in our branches. I have a good amount of water on my brush as well, so that I can ensure that I can render a smooth, small, crisp, clean, sharp line. Without the water, it might look a little bit toothy. It might look a little bit more rough. So water is fantastic for that. You don't want to use too much water though, because otherwise it can become a little bit transparent. So now I'm going to take my medium-sized square-headed brush and I'm going to fill in the black here down at the bottom of our tree. I'm using the larger brush just because it will save a little bit of time. Then what I'm going to do is grab my old square-headed brush, the same one we used to render the trees in the background, and I'm going to begin applying it to the tree here in the foreground, rendering varying clusters of leaves. You want to ensure that these clusters of leaves are always changing and evolving, that some are larger than others, that some connect in different ways. It's also important to note that they all shouldn't be a general circle or an oval. You want to create varying amalgamations of shapes within them to ensure that they are diverse and always changing. That's something that's wildly important when rendering nature landscapes. Ensure that all of your clouds are different, all of your mountains are different, your rocks, your trees, your clusters of foliage. You want it to look natural, and that means not man-made, and that means not completely the same as the thing next to it. So here we're rendering another tree, but the branches, the bark, all of it, they're going to look wildly different from the tree over to the left. And that's really important. It'll really aid your painting, and it's a good lesson to take with you to incorporate in all of your paintings yet to come as well. Here we're rendering more of that foliage, and it's also worth noting that if you want it to be different every time you make that dabbing motion, you can rotate your brush in the air slightly to the right or slightly to the left and then make another dabbing impression. This will just ensure that it's always changing. It's not something I always do in these 10-minute lessons because you need to be cognizant of it and you need to be occasionally kind of careful, but it's a good lesson to incorporate if you have the time. Here I'm just building out a couple of additional strands of bark and all of that, just trying to, again, diversify it. And I think that's really the main theme and message here in this painting. Diversity is wildly important. So at this point, I'm very happy with the painting, and I'm just going to do a couple of little touch-ups with my white here. So I'm adding some additional pieces to our water. Now the white will show up much better than it did because the water itself has dried, and now we're almost working with white on white instead of white on orange and yellow. Then I'm going to make our sun and shining area just a little bit brighter, and I'm actually going to finish this painting out by working a little bit more on our clouds and adding that direction back into the painting. Now the clouds might look a little bit sharp, but here I'm just softening them with my finger, ensuring they are pushed back into the background. But there we have it. There is our 10-minute painting. I truly hope you've enjoyed. If you'd like to learn more about acrylics and all of this, there is a link in the description to my ebook, Acrylics for Beginners. If you're interested in longer lessons, I also have a link in the description to my hour-long painting lessons over on Patreon. With that being said, thank you so much for watching. I post every Saturday. I hope to see you next Saturday. And above all, as always, stay creative.